Are you ready to start with some Compose multi-platform navigation? Then this video will give you a quick start. Hey there, my name is Per-Erik and welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be looking into navigation in Kotlin Multiplatform. But before we start to look into tab navigation, Dialog, Compose navigation, BottomBar navigation, BottomSheet, drawer menu, and for the ones who stick around, I have a bonus at the end. Don't forget to hit that like button, share the video, and subscribe so you don't miss my next video. Now, let's start. As usual, the product I have is downloaded from the JetPack wizard, and the only thing I've done before starting and recording this video is to remove the template code, and I also changed to material 3. The first thing we need to do is to create a tab nav screen compose function, and also we create a preview so that we can see what we are doing. What we need to do then is to create a tab row, and to remember the current selected tab, we also need to have a tab index remembered as well. Since this is a quick introduction, I will keep the tab data just as strings in an array for this example. I will iterate each of these tab titles into a tab where I can check if it's selected or not, or I will set if it's selected or not. I will also tell it to change the selected tab when you click on it. It will also provide the string to show in the actual tab component. Then by using a when statement, I will show the different tabs depending on the selected tab. In this case, I will just add text. In your case, you would probably call a different compose function. We can also add a starting tab to the function so that we can easily preview how it looks in the design. And finally, don't forget to update the application function to call our tab function. Now we should be ready to preview. Let's see how it looks on desktop. And now let's see how it looks on iOS. And finally, we'll see how it looks on Android. Let's move on to the dialog example. First thing we need to do is to create our dialog example function. We also need to add a mutable state so that we can toggle the dialog on and off. We can add a center button inside a box just to have something to click on. We also then need to check if the show dialog variable is set to true, then we will show our dialog. Let's quickly add a preview function just to see how our page will look like with a button. Let's create some content for a dialog. Let's just have a title and a button to close the dialog with for now. And then we will call the content function from our dialog component. And in the callback lambda we get, we'll set the show dialog to false so that we close the dialog. Of course, the dialog works that if you click outside, it will also be closed. Let's also add a preview function to the content so we can look how that looks as well. And of course, don't forget to update the app function so that we can test our dialog. Now let's see how it looks on desktop. Now let's see on iOS. It looks like this. And finally on Android, we have a working dialog looking like this. Now let's look into the newly added adoption of Jetpack Compose Navigation for Compose Multiplatform. The first thing we need to do is to add the dependencies. Let's update the libs catalog with the version and the library. And of course, we also need to add it to the build Gradle file. And don't forget to synchronize your project when it's done. I want to create two screens, one for taking a string input and showing that string in the next screen. Let's start with the input screen. All we really need here is a text label, a text field, and a button to submit the string. And of course, we should add the preview function as well, so we see what we're doing. Moving on to the output screen. Here, the function will take a string as the input and also call back to go back to the previous screen. We will add a greeting to the name that the user added on the previous screen, and then a button to go back to the previous screen. And let's remember to add a preview screen as well. Okay, let's put this together with Compose Navigation. Let's create a new file. Here we can define the two screens we have. We do this in a sealed class. We know we have two screens, the input screen and the output screen. The output screen takes an argument, so we better add that as well. I usually also create a getRoot function to make it a little bit easier to create the correct root. If you want me to create a more in-depth video about the navigation, please leave a comment below and I will do my best. For the compose function, we'll add a nav host. It's the same as Jetpack's navigation library. Inside this nav host, we should add the composable nodes for the screens. I usually do these in an extension functions to the navgraph builder. It makes the code look a little bit cleaner. And then I call that function from within the nav block host. And then I do the same for the output screen. But for this function, we also need to extract the string from the backstack entry so that I can send it to the output screen. And of course, update the app function as well so we can see how it looks. Now let's see how it looks on desktop. And on iOS. And finally on Android. Okay, let's move on to another common scenario, the BottomBar Navigation. For this, we need to add a new file called root navigation. We will define the three root screens we have: tab navigation, dialog example, and the compose navigation example. In these definitions, we will also add a title string and a random icon to show on the bottom bar. To get the bottom navigation, we use the scaffold component and put the nav host inside the content block. We also add the navigation graph extension functions to the tab and dialog screens. After that, let's move back into the argument example screen. We need to do a little bit of adjustment here. Since we will have a nested navigation, I want to have my extension function here. I don't want the knowledge of the inner navigation of these screens outside this package. This will be a nested navigation, and for that we use the navigation instead of the nav host. Then back to the root navigation, and we call the extension function we just created. Let's also update the app function so we don't forget about that one later. Let's create some content for our bottom bar and add it to the bottom bar block in the scaffold. I need to send in the nav controller here, but since I don't like to push the nav controller too far in the hierarchy, I will create a function without the nav controller as well, which will handle all the views. In this second function, we will add the bottom app bar component. We also create a list of the three screens we want to be able to navigate between. And of course, we need to remember the selected item as well. We add a navigation bar with the navigation bar item for each of the screens. And we also make sure that the selected item is updated before we call the onItemClick function. Let's also add a preview function to see if it looks okay. Extracting the nav controller like we did makes it also much easier to do these preview functions. Okay, back to the first function. This is where we will actually do the navigation. We already updated the app function, so we should be able to run and see how it looks on desktop now. And let's run and see how it looks on iOS. And of course, as always, how does it look on Android? Now for the bottom sheet. We need a way to be able to trigger the bottom sheet, so let's add a floating action button, a FAB. We do this in the scaffold as well. A regular one looks a little boring, so let's add an extended one. To be able to control a bottom sheet, we need a sheet state. We also need a boolean to control the visibility. We can, on the click function on the floating action button, set the show button sheet to true. And then we check if the boolean is true to toggle the bottom sheet on and off. Just as with the other components, we also need some kind of content for our bottom sheet. Nothing complicated, just add a button that will close the bottom sheet for now. Let's add a content to the model bottom sheet content block. And in the callback from the content, we can hide the bottom sheet. Hiding the bottom sheet has to be done with the coroutine scope, so let's add one. And now we can hide the sheet where the button is clicked. We haven't changed the entry point, so we should be able to run and look how it looks without updating the app function. Let's look how it looks on desktop. And on iOS, it looks like this. And it works on Android as well. Okay, let's look at the drawer menu or the hamburger menu for a while and see how to add it. We start by adding a top up bar since we need to be able to trigger this bar. We can see how the top up bar looks now with the title. Now let's add a navigation icon. For the drawer menu, we need a drawer state, so let's add one. And then in the navigation icons, on click, let's call open on this state. Remember, this has also to be called within the coroutine scope. The navigation drawer has its own component, which is needed to place around the scaffold since we want it to be on top of everything. Let's look at the content on the drawer menu. The content has to be placed inside a model drawer sheet to get the correct behavior. Inside the content block, we will add navigation drawer item that will call the onClose function and eventually close the drawer menu. Before leaving this file, let's just add a preview function as well. Now back in the root navigation file, in the model navigation drawer component, let's add the drawer content we just created to the drawer content block and close the drawer in the callbacks. Now, let's try it on desktop. And let's try on iOS. And finally, let's try and see how it works on Android. Okay, for the bonus. It's a small bonus, but it is a bonus. Let's make the floating action button only appear on one of the tabs. For this, we need a callback with the selected tab. Let's add that in the bottom navigation bar content. Then back in the root navigation, we add a boolean to remember the state of the floating action button. And in the callback from the bottom navigation bar content, we check if the selected screen is the tab example screen. Then we set the fab to visible, otherwise we set it to invisible. And finally, we surround the floating action button with an animated visibility component. Let's see how it looks. Looks good on desktop. Looks good on iOS. And it looks good on Android. Perfect. Thank you for watching. As always, you can find a link to the GitHub repository in the description below. Feel free to leave a comment suggesting topics that you would like me to cover in a future video. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons to stay updated with the latest content. Happy coding!